There's a specific smell that hits you when you walk into a place that time has forgotten. It's not just dust and mold. It's the smell of interruption. It's the smell of a life that was suddenly paused and never unpaused. See it in the abandoned hospitals with the beds still made. In the factories with the coffee cups still sitting on the break room table, and in the houses where the family photos are still hanging on the wall, but the roof has caved in. Urban exploration, or urbex as some call it, isn't really about the decay. It's about the story of the sudden silence. Most of the time you find rats, maybe some copper thieves, and a lot of peeling paint. But sometimes you find a door that shouldn't be there. Sometimes you find a room that was sealed for a reason that the demolition crew forgot to write down. Sometimes, if you're really unlucky, you find out that the building isn't empty. The 3 stories I'm about to share with you tonight are from people who walked through the broken glass and the silence. They were looking for a good photo or a piece of history. What they found instead will make you lock your basement door and never, ever ignore a condemned sign again. These are 3 true stories of hidden rooms and the things that wait inside them. I'm your guide, and I advise you to stay close to the light. This first account comes from a user named WardC_Explorer, a guy who's been doing this kind of exploration for about 6 years. He's one of those guys who knows how to bypass a padlock without breaking it. Leave no trace is his motto. He had his eyes on the old Fairview State Sanatorium for years. It's a sprawling Gothic red brick complex out in the middle of New England farmland, closed since the late 1970s. Most of the buildings are picked clean. The scrappers got the copper pipes decades ago, and the local kids have smashed every window on the first floor. But there was one building on the campus that nobody went to, the administration annex. It was a smaller, 3-story brick building connected to the main hospital by a long, in a closed walkway that looked like a dark tunnel. The reason nobody went in there was because the door was welded shut. Really welded shut. A thick, ugly bead of steel ran all the way around the frame, sealing the door to the wall like a tomb. Now, to a seasoned explorer like WardC_Explorer, a welded door is the equivalent of a neon sign that says, "The good stuff is in here." He figured they sealed it to keep drug addicts out because maybe the pharmacy was still stocked, or maybe it was full of asbestos. He came back with a battery-powered angle grinder and a friend who was a former structural engineer. It took them 45 minutes of grinding and prying in the freezing November air to get that door to pop open with a sound like a gunshot. The air that rushed out wasn't just stale, it was cold, naturally cold, like opening a refrigerator that hasn't been plugged in for 50 years, but somehow still works. The interior was pristine. It was like walking onto a movie set from 1974. There was no dust, which was the first red flag. And the fluorescent lights in the hallway, of course, were dead. So they were navigating by flashlight. They moved past empty offices and a records room with cabinets hanging open, papers yellowed and curled. Then they found the stairs to the basement, and this is where the tone shifted. The engineer friend, Mike, stopped at the top of the stairs and whispered, "Do you smell that?" It wasn't the smell of a basement, it was the smell of iodine and talcum powder. It was the exact smell of a doctor's office or a hospital nursery. They went down anyway. The basement was small, just a single corridor with 2 rooms. One was a boiler room, dark and full of spiderwebs. The other room had a frosted glass door with chipped gold lettering that read, "Nurses Station Ward C," but Ward C was in the main building. This was an annex. Why was there a nurse's office down here? They pushed the door open, and the flashlight beams landed on something that made WardC_Explorer's stomach drop through the floor. The room was fully furnished. not abandoned furnished. There was a small, neatly made cot against the wall, with white hospital corners on the sheets. There was a wooden rocking chair with a hand-knitted blanket draped over the back. On the desk was an old black rotary phone and a coffee mug. And on the wall, there were newspaper clippings. This is where it gets deeply, personally terrifying. The clippings weren't from 1974, they were from 1998, 2003. In 2012, they were taped to the wall in a perfect grid. They weren't random news, they were all obituaries. Specifically obituaries of women who had worked as nurses at Fairview State Sanatorium in the 1960s. In the center of the grid was a Polaroid photograph. The photo showed two people. The first was a woman in an old-fashioned white nurse's cap and uniform, standing stiffly, smiling a tight, unnatural smile. The second person in the photo was a man in a dark suit and a wide-brimmed hat. But the man's face had been burned away with a cigarette lighter. It was just a black, crispy hole where his features should have been. And underneath the photo, in perfect, looping, cursive handwriting done in black fountain pen ink that looked fresh, not faded, were the words, "He likes it when you're quiet." Ward C_Explorer said the temperature. In that room dropped so fast he could see his own breath crystallize in the beam of his flashlight. He and Mike didn't say a word. They just turned and walked briskly, not running because you don't run from things. In the dark, back up the stairs, out the welded door, and off the property. They left the angle grinder behind. He posted about the experience online and got a private message 2 days later from someone claiming to be a former orderly. The message said, "You should not have gone into the annex. That was his room. He doesn't like visitors. And he knows you saw the photo. Go to church." He never went back to Fairview. He sold his camera gear a month later. Said the smell of iodine and talcum powder now makes him physically sick, and he can't look at a Polaroid camera without feeling like someone is standing right behind his shoulder, leaning in to see who's in the picture. This next story isn't from a seasoned explorer. It's from a guy named Tom R., who was just trying to do his job. Tom is a home inspector. It's his job to crawl into the worst, darkest, spider-infested holes in a house and tell the new buyers if the foundation is going to collapse. He's seen it all: dead raccoons, mold colonies that look like alien planets, and questionable wiring from the 1920s. He thought he was unshakable. Then he took a job at a big old Victorian house in a small town in Ohio. The buyers were a young couple who wanted to turn it into a bed and breakfast. The house had been empty for about 15 years, ever since the old owner, a reclusive man named Mr. Sterling, had died. The local rumor was that Mr. Sterling was a weird guy who never let anyone inside. He paid the paperboy to leave the paper on the sidewalk, not the porch. The house was a disaster on the inside, hoarder-level clutter, stacks of yellow newspapers reaching the ceiling, and a smell of pipe tobacco soaked into the wallpaper for a century. Tom's job was to check the foundation and the crawl space. He found the access hatch in the kitchen floor. It led down to a dirt floor cellar with low clearance. He had to duck walk with his flashlight in his mouth. It was the usual stuff: a few old paint cans rusted through, a broken chair, and a lot of rat droppings. But in the far corner, behind the old coal chute, his flashlight beam caught the edge of something metal. It wasn't a pipe or a duct. It was a door, a small, heavy steel door set into the brick foundation wall. It looked like a bank vault door, but scaled down. There was a combination dial and a heavy steel wheel handle. Now this was a problem. a vault door in a basement wall, isn't on the county property records. It wasn't in the blueprints the buyers had. It meant it was a secret addition. Tom's professional curiosity got the better of him. He tried the wheel, expecting it to be seized shut. It spun smoothly like it had been greased recently. There was a heavy thunk, and the door swung inward. The air that came out was the strangest mix of smells he'd ever encountered. It was the smell of old. Dry paper, mixed with the heavy, sweet smell of honey and rot. He shined his light inside. The space wasn't a room. It was a long, narrow, brick-lined tunnel about 4 feet high and maybe 20 feet deep, and it was filled with dolls. Porcelain dolls, hundreds of them. They were lined up on wooden shelves cut into the brick walls, sitting upright, all facing the entrance. All of them were wearing old-fashioned, hand-sewn Victorian dresses, but the fabric was stained dark brown. Every single doll had something carved into its forehead. Tom crawled closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. The carvings weren't scratches. They were precise, careful letters. Each doll had a different name carved into its porcelain face. Margaret, Eleanor, Agnes, Ruth, and each name had a date carved underneath it. The dates ranged from 1978 to 1991. At the end of the tunnel, there was a small wooden chair. Sitting in the chair was a life-size doll, or at least Tom hoped it was a doll. It was dressed in a white lace nightgown that had yellowed with age. Its hair was real human hair, long and gray, pulled back into a bun. And it was holding a small leather-bound journal in its lap. Tom's brain was screaming at him to leave, but his hands, moving on autopilot, reached out and took the journal. He flipped it open to the last page with writing. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was the shaky, spidery script of an old man. The entry read, "Eleanor came to the back door today. She said her car broke down. She had the most beautiful blue eyes. I told her I would fix her. I always fix them. Now Eleanor will stay here in the cellar with the others, and she will be quiet forever. The eyes are the hardest part to keep from rotting." Tom dropped the journal, looked at the life-size doll in the chair. The doll's eyes were open. They were blue and they were glass. But behind the glass, he could see the dark, shriveled remains of something organic. Tom didn't scream, didn't run. He just reversed. He backed out of that tunnel on his hands and knees, never turning his back on those dolls, never breaking eye contact with that life-size thing in the chair. He pulled the vault door shut and spun the wheel until it locked. He climbed out of the basement, walked to his truck, and called the police from 3 blocks away. The FBI ended up digging up the entire back garden of that property. They found 7 bodies. All women who had gone missing between the late 70s and early 90s. Mr. Sterling had been a taxidermist before he retired. He didn't just collect dolls, he made them. Tom doesn't inspect old houses anymore. He only does new construction. He says he can't walk past a porcelain doll in an antique store without his hands starting to shake. And he still dreams about the sound of that vault door clicking shut, wondering if he remembered to spin the lock all the way, wondering if Eleanor is still sitting in that chair, waiting for someone to open the door and see her blue eyes. Our final story tonight takes us underground into the world of steam tunnels and forgotten infrastructure. This comes from a Reddit user named tunnel_rat_404 who worked for a university's facilities management team. Every big university campus has them a labyrinth of concrete tunnels running under the sidewalks and buildings, carrying steam pipes, electrical conduits, and fiber optic cables. They're hot, loud, and they all kind of look the same. The only way to navigate them is by following faded, color-coded arrows spray-painted on the walls. Tunnel_rat_404 had been working that job for 3 years. He knew the system like the back of his hand. He knew which tunnels flooded in the spring, which ones had the aggressive raccoons, and which ones were haunted by the ghost of some frat kid who fell in a manhole in the 80s. Every campus has that legend. One night a pipe burst in the old physics building, which had been closed for renovation for 2 years. He was sent down into the tunnel alone, which is a safety violation, but it was 2 a.m. and the supervisor didn't want to wake anyone else up. He popped the manhole and climbed down into the familiar heat and the roar of the steam lines. The tunnel to the physics building was one he'd been in 100 times. It was a long, straight concrete box with a single line of flickering caged industrial light bulbs hanging from the ceiling every 50 feet. He was walking along listening to the hiss of steam and the drip of condensation when he noticed something off. There was a side passage on his left. He stopped dead, had the tunnel map memorized. There was no side passage to the physics building. It was a straight shot. He shined his flashlight down the new opening. It was darker than the main tunnel and it was cold. There were no steam pipes. It was just raw, rough-hewn rock, like a mine shaft, with a smooth concrete floor. And on the wall, someone had spray-painted an arrow in bright red paint. But it wasn't pointing forward or backward. It was pointing down. At the floor, beneath the arrow in shaky letters was written, "He is here." He should have turned around. He knows that now. But he was a university employee with a key card and a false sense of security. He figured it was an old Cold War fallout shelter entrance or some student prank. He stepped into the cold passage. The further he walked, the more the walls changed. The rough rock gave way to smooth, black obsidian-like tile. It was clean, immaculately clean. It was lit by a faint greenish glow coming from somewhere ahead. The tunnel opened up into a large, circular room. The room was dominated by a massive piece of machinery that looked like a cross between an old telephone switchboard and a Tesla coil. It was humming with a low, subsonic vibration that he felt in his chest more than he heard in his ears. There were cables as thick as his arms snaking out of the machine and disappearing into holes drilled in the tile walls, and there was a chair, dentist's chair, bolted to the floor in front of the machine, with thick leather straps hanging loose from the armrests. On the floor next to the chair was a bucket. Inside the bucket was a collection of human teeth. Dozens of them. Some were yellow with age, some were white, and some still had fresh blood in the sockets. Tunnel_rat_404 said his mind just went blank with a white noise terror. He fumbled for his radio to call his supervisor, but the radio just emitted a loud screeching feedback loop. And then the machine in the center of the room turned on. A light on the switchboard started blinking. A sound filled the room. Not a mechanical sound, but a voice. It was a low, guttural, wet voice that sounded like someone speaking with a mouth full of water or marbles. It said, "There are not enough teeth. Sit down. We need more." He turned to run back into the rock passage, but the green light was gone. It was pitch black. He had to feel his way along the cold tile wall, his fingers sliding over the smooth surface until he hit the rough rock again. He ran until he saw the dim yellow light of the main steam tunnel. He scrambled up the ladder and out of the manhole and didn't stop running until he was in his truck with the doors locked. The next day, he filed a report with campus security. He described the location of the side passage. They sent a team down. They found the steam tunnel. Found the wall where tunnel_rat_404 said the side passage was. But there was no opening. It was just a solid concrete wall. There were no signs of a doorway being bricked up. It was just wall. He knows what he saw. He quit the job 2 weeks later. He moved to a different state. Yeah, we can't go to the dentist anymore without having a full-blown panic attack. 8. He still has nightmares about the sound of that voice and the sight of those teeth in the bucket. And he wonders if that room is still down there under the university, waiting for someone else to find it, waiting for someone to sit in the chair so it can ask for more teeth. And that's where we leave It's in the Dark, with the sound of a machine asking for teeth still echoing somewhere in the back of your mind. The world is full of doors. Some are painted shut, some are welded, some are hidden behind a coat of fresh plaster in a basement wall. Most of them we walk past every day without a second thought. But these stories remind us that not every door is meant to be opened. Some lead to rooms where the air is too cold, where the dolls have names carved into their faces, and where something is still waiting in the dark with a collection of human teeth. If you're out there exploring or even just poking around in your own attic this weekend, remember these stories. Remember Ward C. Remember Eleanor. And remember the service tunnel. Because the scariest part isn't the ghost or the monster. The scariest part is the truth. The truth that real people, just like you and me, walked through these doors and found something that shattered their reality. If you made it this far, you've got nerves of steel. Show me some love by hitting that like button. It really helps a small channel like this one keep the lights on in these dark hallways. And if you've got your own story of a hidden room or an abandoned place that gave you the creeps, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and trust me, the comments section here is sometimes scarier than the videos. Stay safe out there. Keep your flashlight batteries fresh. And whatever you do, don't open the welded door.